Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And I am delighted to be here for our next latest Indica Books author Q&A. My name is Abhinav Agarwal, and I am the curator of Indica Books. And I am delighted to welcome Dr. Heather Martin, author of The Reacher Guide, the authorized biography of Lee Child. And let me read out a few words about Dr. Heather Martin herself. So, Dr. Heather Martin was born in Geraldton, which is about 250 miles about 250 miles north of Perth on the west coast of Australia. When she was age 16, she left home for 3 years as a music student in London, but never went back. She read languages at Cambridge, staying on to do a PhD, then lectured in Spanish at the University of Hull and King's College London, where she was also admissions tutor. More recently, after working as a freelance editor and translator and a stint as head of languages in an independent primary, she returned to academia as visiting fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature at the Graduate Center, City University, New York. She now lives in London and writes for the independent newspaper. Heather has always been a big reader, and though she never planned to become a biographer, once the idea of writing the Lee Child story took hold, it felt somehow it had to be. It was meant to be. The book she wrote is The Reacher Guide, an authorized biography of Lee Child. It was first published last year in September 2020 by Constable, which is a little brown book imprint, in turn owned by Hachetti. And this year in October, the paperback version came out. So for those of you who don't know, Lee Child is the pen name of James Dover Grant. He is the author of the Jack Reacher novel series, named after the eponymous character Jack Reacher, no middle name, a retired American military policeman who has no home and essentially travels the country, the United States, with just a toothbrush in his pocket. Often traveling on Greyhound buses or hitching rides and getting off wherever the mood strikes him. And these journeys or the towns he finds himself in are where incidents occur, and they form the trigger for the plot and the novel. His first book, The Killing Floor, was published in 1997 and has often been described as having the best opening sequence in modern day thrillers. From 1997 to 2019, he wrote 24 novels, all of them on Jack Reacher, averaging one book a year, with the exception of, I believe, 2010, when 2 books of his were published. Now, a little housekeeping rules. So we are live streaming this on Facebook. So if you head over to facebook.com/group/Indic Book Club, you can watch the Facebook stream live there. We will also put this up on YouTube in a few days once the recording is available. I am going to share links to Dr. Heather Martin's book here in the chat window for those of you who want to try that out. And if you have any questions, please do send them over using the Q&A feature of this Zoom webinar, and we will take them up towards the end. And with that, a very warm welcome, Dr. Heather.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Abhinav.
Great. So reading the book, I got the sense that it's sort of divided into, I think, 2 or 3 parts. So one decision that I think you could have taken was, okay, let's start in circa 1994-95, when Lee Child loses his job at Grenada Television, and that's when he decides to write the book. But you went back 1, 2, 3 generations back to his great-grandfather, and you trace the lineage, the geography, the history, the influences that bore upon not just Lee Child, but his parents and his grandparents. And in doing so, we get a very, very insightful, fascinating look into the person that made turned James Grant into Lee Child, which in turn produced Jack Reacher. How much of a conscious thought was that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I always wanted to do the portrait of an artist as a young man, if you like. What made Jim Grant reinvent himself as Lee Child. And I was conscious of the fact that while anyone picking it up would already, the book up, would already know that they would be doing so because they knew that Lee Child had written 20 odd books about this recurring character, Jack Reacher. But I also felt that from the point where he became established, there's an inevitable element of repetition in his life, the yearly cycle of the Jack Reacher novel and its promotion. So I was particularly interested in the early years. And also there was a kind of unwritten contract with Lee himself, which was, it was very important to him that I should focus on where he came from and what made him who he is in terms of the time and place in which he was born. So therefore I could have started in 1954, the year that he was born. But I did start with his grandparents, and that's partly because once we'd agreed to do, or once I got to know Lee, he would send me little emails or texts, and he'd just drop in some little story about his life, often just a few lines, and one of the ones that I loved just immediately that he told me was about his Otley grandparents from Yorkshire. And, because I'd asked him, and it was prompted by me asking him what the D stood for in his name, because in those days, Wikipedia didn't tell you. It just said James D. Grant. And no one seemed to know. I hadn't seen it written anywhere. So I said, what does the D stand for? And he said, James Dover Grant, after my maternal grandfather, Harry Dover Scrafton. And then he just added, he was the most human of my ancestors. Drank a little, gambled a little, smoked a lot. And it was just such a little story in a nutshell that I wanted to find out more about that grandfather and indeed his wife, and they were Lee's favorite grandparents. When he was staying with them as a boy, that's when he quite openly says he felt happiest. And then another factor, was that when I went to see Lee Child at Harrogate Crime Festival, the Exton Crime Festival in 2017, which was the year he was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award, I realized when I arrived that I was 20 minutes away from Otley, this town where his grandparents lived and where he used to go and holiday as a child. So I thought, that's it. I'm going to catch the bus to Otley and go and see where he used to hang out. And sort of one thing led to another. And then, of course, you can't have one set of grandparents without the other, the Irish side of the family, which is a very important part of his identity as well. And certainly, I think, a big part of him feeling a certain sense of alienation as a young boy. And then there were fascinating stories about, in particular, the Irish grandfather at war. So, yeah, I wanted to go back. Oh, and then, the grandparents in Ireland led to the great-grandparents, because I loved the detail, and it's an important detail, that his great-grandfather was illiterate. So, but his great-grandmother wasn't. Both very interesting facts. And he's come, if you look at Lee Child now, who's written millions of words, published millions of words, he's come a long way from those origins. And if I said that to him, he would say, yeah, well, someone had to, and the odds just fell in his favor. But he's adamant that though he's done this and achieved this exceptional thing, he's really just like anyone else who was born in the time and place that he was.
Right, and
he wanted to be representative.
Correct. And in your book, you also write that, he really never got used to the fact that now he was rich enough to be able to afford almost anything, a person could want. And one of the few indulgences that he allowed himself was, I think, traveling by first class. And that was sort of the limit of his indulgences. And I want to get back to your, to his parents and to his grandparents and so on. But before that, how this biography itself came about is a fascinating story, because in your when I introduced you, I said that you were also a Spanish lecturer, and it is your knowledge of Spanish that led you to send a very detailed critique on one of Lee Child's Spanish translations, one of the Jack Reacher books that had been translated into Spanish, and that is what sparked the conversation. Tell us a little bit about which book was it and why you felt you had to send a critique on that book.
Well, I've never revealed which book it was before, out of respect for the translator, or perhaps out of sympathy or empathy. But maybe now it doesn't really matter anymore. It was personal, the 19th book, and I didn't. Didn't come from me. It came from Lee. He sent me a copy of the book. We'd already been in touch a little bit, and he sent me a copy of the book out of the blue, really, and said, "This is in Spanish. I can't read it. Tell me what you think." And that was a key moment for me, and later for him, I think, insofar as I basically thought, well, either I can tell him it's wonderful, which most fans would do without really thinking and out of courtesy and, just the way one does in life, or I can say what I actually think, which is that it's mixed at best and, does not translate Lee Child, or that Lee Child does not sound like Lee Child in this translation, and that there's no very good reason for that, because as a Spanish specialist, I know how accommodating the Spanish language is, and it can accommodate the rhythms and cadences of English. And what this translator had done was kind of corrected Lee Child's English, if you like, his language. He'd joined sentences that were incomplete to make complete sentences. So
and I think that's fascinating, because one of the trademarks, or one of the very unique things about Lee Child's books, is the sort of staccato feel that you get in some of his descriptions and sentences. Just two words, three words, one after the other. They wouldn't form complete sentences, but I think that's what. And you're saying that the Spanish translation tried to quote unquote correct those.
Tried to normalize the English, really, or the language. And I think the thing about Lee is, yes, he is known for his trademark short sentences and his fragments, but actually he also writes some incredibly long, lyrical, descriptive passages too. And the point is the contrast between those and the choice that he's made. And as I say, Spanish is actually, it's easier in Spanish to start a sentence without the subject of the verb. It's built into the language. So I basically said to him, it didn't need to be done that way. And the irony was that short sentences had been joined and long sentences had been broken up. So it was critical, and it did, in fact, lead to Lee changing his Spanish publisher and stipulating who the translator should be, because then subsequently I read a couple of his short stories or novellas in Spanish, and that was an Argentine translation, and I thought they were excellent. And so I said, I think these are great. And basically Lee went to that publisher and said, I want that translator for all my books in Spanish from now on. And for him, that was it was a turning point in terms of me doing the biography, because as he himself said, that was the moment when he thought, yeah, she knows what's important to me about my writing, and I feel I can trust her. And not just trust her in terms of his work, but trust me to tell him what I think as well, to be fairly sort of honest and straightforward with him, which by that point in his career, of course, people were mainly just telling him how great he was all the time, and not really daring to sort of step out of line. It's the mixed blessing of fame and fortune, really.
I can imagine. And when it comes to authors who are larger than life, for reasons of their success and all, there is a certain mystique and aura that develops around them, and the average reader likes to think of them as some sort of mystical creatures that go into some dark den and they come out with this finished manuscript and all. And we don't often stop to think about the influences that inform their style of writing, what they write about, the locations, and so on. was there any kind of a concern, among you or Lee Child that writing about, the man himself, and there are essentially, as you say, there are not one, two, but there are three people in here. There's Lee Child, there's James Grant, and then there's Jack Reacher, and they blend into each other to some extent, but there are also distinct, personalities and all. But reading your book, I got the sense I could somehow start to understand what had gone into the forming of Jack Reacher himself. And was there a sense that, okay, why get into that? Let the aura mystique be. Or was it like it's important, it's useful if people, or it doesn't matter if people find out?
I think that Lee himself would have been quite happy to let the mystique be. When I started to get to know him well and started to, I began to appreciate that a certain amount of the information about him in circulation was factually incorrect. And I would say to him, oh, look, that's wrong. That's not actually what you did do at Granada Television. You did something different. He said, yeah, that's fine. I like it. I like it that way. He said, and he has a very strong belief. And I call this book The Reacher Guide because he writes the Reacher books, and that's how he identifies himself, as the guy who writes the Reacher books. But I could have called it The Backstage Guy because, by nature and in his past, he did a lot of work in theatre and it was always backstage. And he has a very strong conviction, and it's entirely legitimate, that the book is what matters. I mean, it is the book that matters, and it's the book that it's out there in the marketplace, and it's the book that the reader buys and reads and responds to and interacts with. It's the book that the reader has a relationship with, and that fundamentally the author doesn't matter. And of course, that is strictly true. But when I met him, and I'm not the only person, when I met him, I sort of, realized he's such a fascinating character. In a way, he's led a very ordinary life, but in a way, it's been very extraordinary. And when you hear him speak, he's a fascinating speaker, a great interlocutor. He says surprising things in surprising ways. And I also noticed that although fans are basically preoccupied by Jack Reacher, when's the next book coming out, and they would queue to get their Jack Reacher books signed, they were increasingly queuing round the block 2-3 hours in the rain for the chance to meet the guy who created Jack Reacher and to say hello and to shake his hand in the days when we could, and then to say goodbye. I mean, a matter of seconds with this man, but they wanted to meet him. And I thought, people would like to know more about this man. And Lee basically put up with it. He was gracious about it. I don't think he thinks it matters very much.
Yeah, I think he more than put up with it. You write about, those signing the first edition copies, and you write about how he did that without any complaint, literally thousands of copies he signed. And in fact, when one compares the signatures of him and yours, well, yes, I can understand why his sign would have taken an order of magnitude less effort on his part to sign thousands and thousands of copies, but still, it is something that he did.
Yeah, no, he was very collaborative, actually. He was very permissive when I was writing it, really left the whole thing entirely to me, just read it at the end to fact check it, if you like. And he was very collaborative as well. He gave me a lot of time. Once he'd committed to it, he gave me a lot of time. He was very generous with his time, and both in person and in correspondence. So that, we basically sustained a conversation over several years, which enabled me to really get to know him and, feel that I could tell his story with a degree of authenticity and let his voice be a big part of it as well, which was important to me because he has such a distinctive voice. And I wanted people to, when they read the book, to feel a bit like they are spending all that time with Lee Child, that I had the privilege of doing.
Right. And, the point that the book is not, how should I say it? The book is not a hagiographical tribute to Lee Child. It's fairly raw in places in what it reveals about Lee Child. But I'd like to take you back to one particular section where, when his first draft, that is of The Killing Floor, went to the publisher, And I think it was Highfield, or I forget the name of the editor, who said, we have to cut 150 pages out of this book. And I think you write that one of the scenes that went on for 10 pages in the final published version was just 1 page long. And he put up with all of that. And later on in his books, and in one of his, I think, interviews or so, again, you write that he said that I tell my editors that they get to make 3 suggestions and I will accept one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that is the trajectory. It's absolutely right. He was astute enough to realize at the beginning that although he had a lot of self-belief and a lot of confidence in himself, he would have a lot to learn as well. And so he accepted that learning process. And when I asked about speaking to his editors, he said, only speak to, you only need to speak to David Highfield, who was the first one, because he was very formative. He was a very formative part of the process. We worked on those early books closely together. And indeed, the correspondence between them reveals that, absolutely. And yes, the contrast in tone is extraordinary, because at the beginning it's, right, well, what you say goes, you're the boss, I'm willing to take your advice, whatever you say. I mean, you might sense him gritting his teeth once or twice, but yeah, later, no. Later, I think he felt he'd learned his trade, he's learned his craft, he'd proved that he could do it, he'd proved that he could do it 10, 15, 20 times, and they should just let him get on with it and do the job that he knew so well how to do. You were talking about mystique earlier, and he would absolutely, that's one of the things that he has absolutely no time for. Whilst there is mystique around the author in the sense that he thinks readers don't need to know about the author, there's no mystique for him about the business of writing. For him, it's a job which he takes very seriously. That is not to downgrade it at all. On the contrary, in his eyes, it's something that he treats absolutely seriously. He learned his craft, and he goes about it as effectively and responsibly as he can to produce the kind of book his readers want and to deliver exactly what they want every year on time, as though he were in a quite different business than writing, really.
Absolutely. And, to the point, so there are a couple of points that you touched upon. One is that, he knows the business of writing, and you quote him as saying that, and I forget what context it is in, that he says that I may not be able to grow more talent than you, but I can outwork you. And I think that is one of the lessons that I think almost any aspiring writer would be should take away. And there is, yes, no mystique to writing. The words don't appear. I mean, if you look at his books are probably 150,000 words. Each one of them is about 150,000 words or more in length. And it takes a lot of patience, time, effort, discipline to crank them out. In fact, his first book was written on paper with pencil twice over, I believe.
Correct. Well, the once in pencil and once in pen, but yes, you're absolutely right. Written out by hand twice and then typed many times. And one of the details that I adored was that when he'd finished the whole thing, he decided that he would test the product by rewriting the first chapter entirely in the third person, because he'd written the whole book twice in 2 or 3 times in the first person. He thought, no, I must just test the third person. So he rewrote the first chapter in the third person, thought, no, prefer the other, threw it in the bin or in the box, and stayed with his original instinct, which was that the first person would be right for his first book. But when I had the privilege of working in the archive, and I'm one of the few people to have seen that original handwritten manuscript, I don't think even his publishers have ever seen it, I was absolutely blown away by the amount of work entailed, not just all those handwritten words, but all the calculations that went alongside and all the analysis of other writers' work to see how his would fit alongside theirs. And I remember texting him at the time and saying, wow, you really worked hard on that first book. And I gave him some examples and he said, yeah, unimaginable now. And he'd pretty much forgotten, I think, how hard he had to work at first. And that was probably one of the things that he quite enjoyed about the process of doing the biography, was being reminded of those early days and how much effort he put into learning his trade, if you like. And he does associate that trade very much with his origins. So to come back to one of our earlier points about why it mattered that, where he's from, he sort of always says, being from Birmingham, from Coventry, from the Midlands, which was all about sort of metalwork, car manufacture, making beautiful things in metal, basically, and doing it well, that was his model for writing, that he was very much influenced by the attitude of those sort of industrial workers, in fact.
Correct. And there's not only a lot of detail about that, but one thing that I really loved about the book was that you have included photographs of his first manuscript, including his own corrections, notes, annotations. Yes. And I think to the point on calculations, I think there is a calculation on how thick would U.S. currency notes be, because the first book, The Killing Floor, is the climax is set in a warehouse, and you're talking about lots and lots of currency notes, and he went to the extent of calculating how much they would, what the dimensions would be, how much they would weigh, and all. Exactly. And this is in the time before we knew the internet as we know it today, before Google itself existed.
Yeah, and he's always had a great head for trivia and always been interested in learning and knowledge and information, and he's got a phenomenal memory for that sort of thing. So he would do that sort of thing out of personal interest as well as out of professional pride, wanting to get his facts straight. But also the calculations were things like, what's the average length word in a work of commercial fiction? How many letters per word? What's the average? And how many lines per page? And how many pages, per chapter? And where does his book sit between John Grisham and I think it was Patricia Cornwell? And, is he getting it about right? So examining all those things. And another fascinating thing, how important, basically his books are all about the character, but he had one paragraph on the character in his notes. He knew that obviously there was a clarity about that in his mind. He knew exactly what he wanted from his character. One decent sized paragraph, and on plot, a very short paragraph. Those were not the things that were uppermost in his mind. It was the mechanics of it, the style, the voice. And, you mentioned that staccato voice, and he very much felt that would be appropriate for the character that he was wanting to write about, someone who cared, like Lee Child himself does, about getting things right, but also doesn't like to waste words and is quite a quiet guy, happy in his own company. So that's very much Lee Child himself.
And when one reads your book, part of the puzzles of the piece start to fall in place in understanding Jack Reacher, the character himself, why he's a loner, why he's not, romantically entangled, attached with anyone for any length of time, or certainly not beyond the length of a book in most cases. And I felt some sort of, a little bit of a sadness also, at what might have driven the evolution of Jack Reacher, because, you're right that, or Lee Child says that when Jack Reacher came to him fully formed, there was no development, emotional arc, so to say, that we would expect or we would see from the character himself. He was what he was, and apart from a couple of pangs of not remorse or regret, but maybe thought, he was pretty much, in book 24, he is what he was in book number 1. Did you get the sense that the character Jack Reacher is in part or substantially a manifestation of Lee Child himself?
I think there are so many aspects to that question. I think the thing is that that the creation of a fictional character called Jack Reacher was triggered by his dismissal from Granada Television, was triggered by him losing his job. But actually turned out that Reacher had, if you like, inhabited Jim Grant's psyche from the time that he was a boy. And he was a bit of a loner as a boy. He was also a huge reader, loved reading books, and loved mainly reading books about escape. He wasn't particularly happy at home as a child. And I think all children like reading books about escape and getting away from their parents and having adventures and doing their own thing. And he was like that, but to an even greater extent. And he especially loved the kinds of books that he read, which had, Reacher-style heroes in them. But I think that also as he wrote more books and became increasingly self-aware and conscious of his craft and what he was doing, he began to ask himself where the character had come from. I think initially it did, as he says, come fully formed, and he didn't want to jinx it. He just let that character be who he was. But later on, he did start to reflect more on the character. And I think he basically just felt that the character of Reacher was actually, feels very strongly, in fact, is an ancient character that goes back to the beginning of storytelling. The hero who saves the day, who protects the tribe, who possibly then rides on and, does good deeds elsewhere. That it was an archetypal character, a mythic character. And archetypal mythic characters do not change. They do not have character development. They do not live in one town and get married and settle down and have domestic issues to worry about, or worry about when they're going to do their washing or have to go to the supermarket or anything like that. He was able to dispense with all that. And so you've got this kind of mythical character, ancient character, inhabiting a contemporary realist world, which is quite an interesting juxtaposition. And I think increasingly he just felt that character has a job to do, even in modern day world, because people want that kind of consolation that fiction can bring, of a guy who sorts out the problems that are never going to be sorted out in real life. And so you get respite from some of the frustration that you experience in real life by reading those books. And increasingly, he would say, I worked very, very hard at not changing the character. Even though I myself was changing and getting older, I didn't want him to change, because readers want Reacher to stay as he is. And they want to be able to, when they come, I love this image because it's so antithetical to the way we perceive Reacher, but he wants, when people return to the next Reacher book, he wants it to feel like they're pulling on an old sweater, a comfy old sweater, coming home, and just feeling at home with Reacher. But, the reason, I think, for his extraordinary success, and the reason Lee Child himself has become a household name, is because he has created, there are many best-selling authors, but there are still relatively few who manage to create a character who transcends their books. Many people know the character, even if they haven't read the books. Many people know the character even if they haven't heard of the author, as he would wish. And that's, that makes Reacher a bit like Robin Hood or something. He's a character, or one of the knights of King Arthur's tales, a name that we know, and a character we're aware of, who, we almost think of as someone real from history, if we'd lived in a different time or place, we might have run into him, because he's a real character, even though unreal. And that is an extraordinary achievement, I think.
Another thing that struck me about your book was the amount of references that you drop in from his so many books. Obviously you've read, I think by the time you finished the book, 22, 23 books had come out, or maybe all 24, or the first 24 had come out. But how did you put all of this together? Because those books are not 100-page long books. Each one of them is about 500 plus pages, and we are talking of 24 books. That's many, many, many pages. How did you put all of this together?
Well, I I didn't interrogate my own process very much at the time. Rather, I did take a leaf consciously out of Lee's own book. And I thought, I'm just going to do this on instinct. I'm going to take one step at a time. I'm going to take one chapter at a time. So I did decide early on not that Reacher would have to be there from the beginning. Partly because it was Reacher that I met first. I met Reacher before I met Lee Child, but partly because of what I said before, that anyone picking up the book would be aware of Reacher. So it'd be artificial to wait 39 years before I mentioned him. So I knew Reacher was going to be there from the beginning. And increasingly that made existential as well as aesthetic sense, because I knew that he had been part of Lee's life from the beginning. And in terms of my own process, I basically needed an idea or an image or a concept or a moment in time for each chapter to see me through each chapter. And I wanted each chapter to be a kind of self-contained story, so that people, because I knew it was going to be a long book. A Life is bound to be a long book, although shorter than his first draft of Killing Floor. And as I wanted people to be able to read a self-contained story in each chapter. And I guess at the same time, I was rereading the books, and I just made a note of words and phrases that resonated with me now that I had come to know Lee Child so well as a man. So rereading the books was fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating anyway. I love rereading, but I suddenly could see, oh, that's where he was living at that point. You know, he's introduced that place into his book, or that's the car he was driving when he was a student, and he's just throwing that in there. Or Bad Luck and Trouble. Oh, of course, 10 years to the day since he was sacked from Granada, he decides to get the old unit back together. A moment of sentiment. You know, he doesn't see himself as a sentimental guy, but there he was actually thinking about his old colleagues from 10 years before and wondering what they were getting up to. Hence, you know, Bad Luck and Trouble is the kind of book it is. And so I guess the books resonated with me in a new way. So it was relatively easy for me to pick up details. And when I, you know, was reading about Joe Reacher, I recognized the relationships he described with his brother or brothers. And when I was reading about Josephine Reacher, I realized that she was the antithesis of the way he perceived his own mother. And so it just all made a lot more sense to me. And, you know, I could see that I mean, they say that fiction is essentially a rectification of reality, don't they? It transforms the real. And you know, you can see elements of that in his work. But yeah, I just kind of, I just trusted to my own storytelling instinct, I think. I very much wanted to write a biography that was academically informed and well-researched, but that would have a strong storytelling feel to it, because I'm writing about a master storyteller. So I wanted it to be enjoyable for the reader insofar as I was capable of making it so.
I can say without reservations that it has, you know, your effort has succeeded, spectacularly. It is a story that you're reading about a storyteller. And I have, on that note, I have two questions. The first one is, when it comes to biographies, is there any, you know, what are your favorite biographies?
I'm not a big reader of biographies, really. It was not because I'm a fan of biographies that I wanted to write the biography. I just met the man and thought, someone's got to write this biography. Someone's got to tell this story. And why shouldn't it be me? I feel that I've got this book in me. I feel I'm capable. I feel I really want to do it. In fact, I felt driven to do it. So, and actually at that point, I deliberately avoided reading too many biographies because I felt it would be a bit like, you know, consulting a how-to manual. And I suspected that it would paralyze me, that I would worry about the way other biographies had been done and that mine perhaps wasn't being done in that way. And I just, wanted to write the book that was my book, the book that I had in me. Something, again, that Lee Child stresses very, very much, that, your book has to have a beating heart. And by that, he means it has to be your book, has to be what you want to write, not what someone else thinks you should write or what you think you should be doing because you're writing in a certain genre. Having said that, I kind of big fan of Ian Gibson's biography of Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, from back in the day, partly because there again, that's a guy with a very, very interesting story, and I love his writing. So that's one I would mention. And that probably is one of the shorter ones as well. I mean, I do think biography is a tricky genre, really, because by definition, you're trying to write the story of a man's life, but by definition, or a person's life, but you're leaving most of it out. And yet at the same time, you feel compelled to put a lot in. So, they can become unwieldy very quickly. And I didn't want, and I've picked up biographies and wanted in good faith to read them, and stopped after a couple of chapters because I found the first chapters very interesting and then thought, not so engaged anymore. So I didn't want to sort of think too much about the fact that I was writing a biography. And I just tried to think, I'm telling Lee Child, or the story of his life, which is just a slightly different emphasis.
So what about the Jack Reacher series? There are 24 books that Lee Child wrote, and the next 2 have been written in collaboration with his brother. But if you look at the first 24, which are your favorite? Or which are your favorites?
I'm not very good on favorites because I just find favorites difficult because there's always so many. But
let me modify that question. Let me modify that question then. So one of the again, you write that I think one of his editors said that there are 3 things that a novel has to take care of. There is plot, there is character, there's pacing. Which ones off the top of your mind do you think his books achieve that the best in terms of maybe character or pacing or plot?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can leave out Killing Floor. I have to say, I mean, he establishes the character so strongly in that first book, and it has terrific pace. It's a real page turner. And the plot was the thing that had to work hardest on. The plot changed completely from the first draft to the published version. In fact, it was about drugs initially rather than about the thing that it is about. So I think that I would have to mention that as having a special place in my heart and that of any Reacher fan, perhaps especially for me because I've seen its evolution, and that makes it very special to see how quickly his style evolved and why he made the decisions that he did. But then I also think Gone Tomorrow, which is set in New York, a location he knows intimately, of course, and loves dearly, has incredible pace. I mean, it starts fast and it starts tense and it doesn't let up.
I have to admit, Gone Tomorrow, please correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't this the one where he's sitting in a subway and he spots this a woman, and that's how it begins? I have to admit that is incredible. I mean, yes, and I think you write that was also his homage to New York and its subways, right?
Yeah, it's a very accomplished book. I think and I think he wrote that one with terrific energy and ease. It was not difficult for him in any way. It just is, the way he says it very simply is, it started well and it just kept going, and so he felt supremely confident as he was writing it, as though it was almost writing itself. But then moving on from that, I think Make Me is one of the most rounded as a novel, number 20. The prose in Make Me is exquisite, in my opinion. Very, very accomplished. My personal favorite is actually the one, it's number 22, a late one. And most people say, oh, it's got to be the early books. But I especially love The Midnight Line. I think he deals with some very big themes in that book. He deals with addiction, drug addiction, but it covers all aspects of addiction. He deals with the plight of war veterans, which is a deep and difficult theme, and he also deals with the theme of beauty, which is a bold theme. Is a bold theme to explore, but also I just think it's the one where his style and the plot are perfectly married, because he starts out searching for a ring. That prompts the whole story, the whole plot, and the book basically finishes when he solves the mystery of the ring, and the whole journey in that book is reflected in the prose. It's just there's a perfect marriage between style and content there, I think, plot and discourse, if you like. And I think, he was not reflecting on his own practice while he was writing it, but it's very easy to see that, in fact, he was not consciously doing so, but it's clear that he was at some level. So, for example, when people say to Reacher, why are you so obsessed with the ring? Why do you want to know who the owner was? Why do you want to know where it comes from? And he says, I don't know. I just want to find out the answer. I just want to know the answer. I just want to know the end of the story. So it is a reflection on his own fictional practice, as well as being a brilliant story and novel in its own right. So for me, that's the most perfect of his books.
I have to admit that's a favorite of mine also, The Midnight Line. And he always was sure he was going to write 21 books and be done with it. It's another matter that he ended up writing 3 more. But how much of it was a number plucked out of thin air, that if I write 1 book a year and if I can continue doing this every year, then at least I know what I'll be doing for the next 2 decades? Or was it more, a number into which more conscious thought went in?
I think the number comes straight from John D. MacDonald. One of the few people he cites, one of the few writers he cites as a direct influence, creator of the Travis McGee character, another larger-than-life character. So when he approached the publisher, and the publisher said, what's coming next after this first book? He said, I'm going to write 21 novels like John D. MacDonald. Now, partly that was just a selling point. That was partly showing, that he had that self-belief that he needed in order to sell himself to the publisher and to the agent. But I think if you were to ask him, he would say, well, of course, when I started out, I thought a series would be nice, but I never imagined that I would really write 21 books or 24 or whatever and counting, because that would just be ridiculous to imagine that kind of success ahead of it happening. Exactly. You'd have to be insane, he would say. But then obviously at a certain point, he realized that he could do it and that he was good at it. And he, I think, did feel that he could write 1 book a year, and he resisted all pressure to write 2 books a year. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction that there was 1 year when he wrote 2 books, and that's because at the end of 61 hours, he accidentally finished on a cliffhanger. And by that stage, he had millions of fans, all of whom were distraught, thinking that possibly he'd killed Reacher off, and that was the end. They thought, oh, he's dead. How could he escape from that alive? And that's the end, but no one's told us. And there was such a backlash from, his readership that the publishers he put pressure on himself to bring out a book within 6 months. And they turned that problem into a marketing asset, because they did a lot of trailering, find out the secret, what really happened, the secrets in the vault or whatever. I can't quite remember the details of the campaign, but they made a big campaign out of that fear, playing on that fear that the readers had, that Reacher had been killed off prematurely. So, and then I think he really did want to stop at 21, but it's difficult to stop when the demand is so high, and when you have collaborated for such a long time with a publisher and have great respect for your publisher, as he does. And I think he probably, in the end, just thought there was huge demand from readers and from the publisher. And though he himself wanted to stop at 21, I think he basically thought, well, how hard is it for me? I can write 3 more books.
I can imagine. To that end, there are a couple of questions that have come in. and it's a sort of a natural segue from what you just said. So Ranjit asks, who's an author himself, by the way, has Lee Child ever felt fatigued about Reacher, akin to Arthur Conan Doyle about Sherlock Holmes?
Um, he, I don't think he felt fatigued by Reacher particularly. I think he has got the kind of brain where he could go on telling Reacher stories till the end of time, because he always has ideas for stories. He's never short of ideas. And Reacher is an infinitely movable character because he's not tied to a particular place or particular people. So he can pop up anywhere, anywhere in the world. If Lee wants him to. But what he did become fatigued by, and there's absolutely no doubt about this, and it's entirely understandable, although less so to an author, like myself, who's not experienced the same kind of pressure. What he did become fatigued by was that one of the chapters is called The Treadmill, the endless business of promotion and the circus, if you like, around each book coming out, and feeling increasingly that he was owned. This is anathema to him because he values his personal freedom hugely. So feeling that he was owned by the public, owned by his readers, owned by his publishers, owned by the industry, and always, at a certain point, this is late in his career, always doing things for other people because he could serve the industry very effectively. And I think he literally weary of that, very weary in particular of touring, because, it was very physically wearing and quite emotionally draining as well. So I think had he been able to continue writing without doing any of the extra business that you have to do as an author these days, he might well have continued writing. I think they tried that with those final 3 books of the 24. He said, okay, I'll do you 3 more, but I don't want to tour and I don't want to do this and I don't want to do that. Didn't work because the demand is there and you say yes to one person and then you say yes to another. And so I think that's the thing that he really needed to create some breathing space for himself as a man, as an individual.
And you touch upon this in your book itself, which is, the character Jack Reacher itself, growing to the point where the readers owned him more than Lee Child himself. And this came out very, very starkly in the movies. And there's a question again by Ranjit on the same topic. And he asks that, what does Heather think of the casting in the Jack Reacher movies? The first film was good, ... But and you write in your book that there was this one point where this waitress comes up to him and says, something like, I love your books or something, but, Tom Cruise is absolutely not the right character to play. And he says that, if I recall again, that yes, there were a few people that were put off by the casting of Tom Cruise, who's physically very different from the Jack Reacher character, but it opened up the universe of his books to a lot more people than would have otherwise. And he, I think, realized at one point, maybe after the first or the second movie, that the readers owned Jack Reacher more than he did at that point.
Absolutely, and that's the price of success, really. I think he took a very pragmatic approach to the casting. Let's face it, there were very few A-list actors, and Tom Cruise was one of them. It's hard to say no to Tom Cruise, especially when he basically runs the film company that's producing your book, making a movie of it. But I think also there was a certain weariness around that for Lee. The Killing Floor was optioned on the day it was published in 1997. And it went through various, pre-development phases, different companies and one thing another. And, then in 2005, it still hadn't been made. And that's when Tom Cruise bought the rights to the whole series, to the franchise, or his company did. And still it wasn't made till 2012, mainly because there were all sorts of things going on around Tom Cruise himself during that period. So by the time Lee was asked, by the time they sent a delegation to New York to say to him, guess what, it's going to be Tom playing Reacher, he was, just happy to see the film made and, grateful, really appreciative that Tom Cruise should like his books. Apparently the reason he wanted to play the part was because he loved the script so much. So he was appreciative of that. But also, again, don't forget, he's a man from television in his background. He realizes, or he understands better than most writers, probably, the pressures on the industry and the way the industry works. And he also took a very relaxed view, which he later came to realize his readers could not achieve. They could not achieve that sort of Zen-like attitude, because he basically thought, my book is my book. Nothing that anyone can do to my book will change the words that I've written. The book is forever there on the shelf. You can get it down and you can read it. And he thought of the film as an interpretation. So insofar as you might see him as a rock star or a pop star, he'd written a great song and someone else was coming along and going to do a cover version. He was fine with that. He knew it would be different to his book, and he accepted that from the outset, and he was relaxed about it. But what he came to realize was that readers were not so relaxed, particularly when it came to the stature of the character playing, or the actor playing the character. And yeah, I do mention in the book, and I know you've picked up on it before, that it was in 2017, I heard him at a talk, and he literally said on stage in front of a huge audience, because his audiences were always huge by that stage, he said, I made a mistake. And there was a sharp intake of breath. And then he said, I didn't make a mistake in saying yes to Tom Cruise. That was perfectly rational decision. It's Tom Cruise. He's making my movie. He's going to open up massive markets. I'm going to sell a whole lot more books. And it's absolutely true that his sales volumes just doubled or, multiplied exponentially after the movies. They were already big and then they became huge. But and he said, the mistake I made was in underestimating the reaction of my readers and the pain and frustration and disappointment my readers would feel. And he was acknowledging there publicly that he had misread, he'd misread the room, if you like, as far as his readers were concerned. But yeah, I think if you write a recurring series character and that character is successful enough, there comes a point where people expect the character to behave in a certain way and do certain things. And when he doesn't do those things, he gets letters saying, hey, Reacher didn't do this in that book, or he didn't drink enough coffee, or he didn't beat enough guys up, or whatever, he didn't do this thing, he didn't do a headbutt, or because the readers feel they've got a say. And he also got a terrific amount of hate mail over the Tom Cruise role, which I think was another big factor in him deciding and wanting to retire, because he was weary of having to deal forever with the fallout from that and that question. And also just of the sort of what he eventually came to feel was a certain lack of understanding from his readers, that, he was trying to see it from their point of view, but they weren't trying to see it from his point of view.
It was a fascinating exercise, and I suppose we will have to wait another year or so before the new adaptation of his books comes, I think on Amazon or Amazon Prime, I think. But we are at the top of the hour, and I would like to say this has been an amazing, very insightful, engrossing conversation. I think I've learned even more from this, from our conversation, than I did from reading the book, which is a marvelous read. I would strongly encourage everyone to pick up a copy. It's, as I said, in India, at least, it is available in both paperback and Kindle ebook format. So, do give it a read. And any last words for all of us?
Just to thank everyone who's come along and listened and joined in today, and to thank anyone in advance who picks up the book. And I hope you enjoy the read, and I hope you enjoy finding out more about Lee Child and Jack Reacher, and in particular James Dover Grant, who after all created them both. And thank you very much, Abhinav, for hosting and indeed for reading my book. with such loving care and attention to detail. I've really appreciated, your kind of the way you've picked up on little details in the book and the way you appear to have enjoyed them and they've resonated with you. And I hope that there's some for the aspiring writers and the practicing writers, that there's been plenty of interest in this conversation, but also I think there would be a lot in the book about the process of writing, the business of writing, and the business of publishing indeed. And quite a lot of that sort of information that really isn't available elsewhere in things that have been written on Lee Child previously.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that I enjoyed your book is a tribute to how well you have written it and put it together. So again, Dr. Heather Martin, a big thank you from all of us, and thank you for coming to do this Q&A. The book is The Reacher Guide, the authorized biography of Lee Child, and it is available in paperback, hardcover, and ebook. So on behalf of Indica Books, thank you once again.
Thank you.